Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Dale Riker had been running Highway 281 through the Texas Hill Country for close to 17 years, and he knew every curve, every grade, every place where the asphalt buckled from the heat. He knew which rest stops had decent coffee and which ones you avoided after dark, knew where the state troopers liked to sit with their radar guns pointed at the southbound lanes. The route between San Antonio and the Panhandle was his bread and butter, a straightforward haul that paid well enough and kept him moving. He preferred night drives when the traffic thinned out and the road belonged to the trucks, when you could set the cruise control and let the highway hypnotize you into a kind of waking meditation. The darkness didn't bother him. He'd always felt more at home in it than in daylight, more comfortable with the glow of his instrument panel and the twin cones of his headlights carving through the black than he ever did in the glare of noon. It was late October when things started feeling wrong. Dale had picked up a load of machine parts in Austin, bound for a manufacturing plant outside Amarillo. The manifest said the cargo weighed in at just under 40,000 pounds, well within his rig's capacity, and the loading crew had secured everything properly. He'd done his pre-trip inspection by the book, checked his tires and lights and fifth wheel connection, topped off his diesel and DEF fluid. Everything was in order. He pulled out of the depot just after 10 p.m., aiming to make Amarillo by dawn if he pushed through without more than a quick fuel stop. The weather forecast called for clear skies and light winds, perfect conditions for making good time. Highway 281 stretched out before him, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the limestone hills, and Dale settled into his seat with a thermos of coffee and a playlist of old country stations crackling through his CB. The first hour passed without incident. Dale made good time through the outskirts of Austin, merged onto 281, and headed north into the hill country. The landscape rolled past in shades of black and gray, the scrub oak and juniper nothing more than darker shadows against the night sky. Occasionally he'd pass another truck headed south, their headlights flaring briefly before they swept past with a blast of displaced air that rocked his cab. The CB was mostly quiet, just the occasional transmission from other drivers calling out their positions or warning about construction zones. Dale kept his eyes on the road and his hands steady on the wheel, his mind drifting through the comfortable monotony of the drive. He was thinking about his daughter's upcoming birthday, wondering if he'd make it home in time to see her, when he noticed the headlights in his mirrors. They appeared suddenly, as if they'd materialized out of nothing, a pair of bright white lights maybe a quarter-mile back. Dale glanced at his speedometer. He was doing 65 in a 70 zone, right where he liked to cruise, and figured the vehicle behind him would overtake in a minute or two. But the lights didn't get closer. They stayed exactly where they were, maintaining the same distance, matching his speed perfectly. Dale watched them in his side mirror for a few miles, waiting for the vehicle to either pass or fall back. But it did neither. It just hung there, a constant presence in his wake, and something about that consistency started to feel deliberate. He tapped his brakes lightly, letting his speed drop to 60, and the lights behind him dimmed slightly as the distance adjusted. Then they resumed their position, exactly where they'd been before. Dale tried the CB, keying the mic and calling out on channel 19. "This is northbound 281 at mile marker 73. Anybody got ears on? Got a vehicle hanging on my bumper, wondering if you're looking to pass." Static answered him, the kind of white noise that suggested no one was listening or no one wanted to respond. He tried again, switching to Channel 9 and the emergency frequency, but got the same result. The CB wasn't dead. He could hear the hiss and pop of background interference. It just wasn't picking up any other traffic. That was unusual for this stretch. There were always a few trucks running 281 at night. Always somebody chattering about road conditions or fuel prices or the waitress at the truck stop in Lampasas. The silence felt heavy, oppressive, like the radio waves themselves had been smothered. The lights stayed with him for another 20 miles. Dale tried speeding up, pushing his rig to 75, and the lights accelerated to match. He slowed down to 55 and they slowed with him. He changed lanes even though the highway was deserted, and the lights changed lanes too, staying directly behind him like they were tethered by an invisible rope. His hands started to sweat on the steering wheel. This wasn't normal driving behavior. This was something else. Something that felt intentional and predatory. He thought about pulling over, maybe forcing whoever it was to reveal themselves. But the idea of stopping on a dark stretch of highway with an unknown vehicle behind him made his stomach tighten with unease. The terrain began to change as he climbed higher into the hills. The road curved more sharply here, winding between limestone outcroppings that rose up on either side like the walls of a canyon. The trees grew thicker, their branches reaching over the asphalt to form a tunnel of darkness that his headlights barely penetrated. Dale kept checking his mirrors, and the lights were still there, unwavering, patient. He tried the CB again, cycling through every channel he could think of, but the static remained unbroken. It was like he'd driven into some dead zone where no signal could reach, where he was completely cut off from the rest of the world. The isolation pressed in on him, made worse by the presence of those lights that refused to either advance or retreat. Then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, the lights vanished. Dale blinked, thinking maybe his eyes were playing tricks on him, but when he checked all 3 mirrors, the road behind him was completely dark. No headlights, no taillights, nothing. Just empty highway stretching back into the night. He eased off the throttle, letting his speed drop, half expecting the lights to reappear. But they didn't. The CB crackled to life with a burst of conversation, 2 drivers discussing a way station up ahead, and Dale realized he'd somehow passed back into normal range. He took a shaky breath and reached for his thermos, his hands trembling slightly as he unscrewed the cap. Maybe it had just been another driver messing with him, playing some kind of stupid game. But that didn't explain the way the lights had matched his every move, or how they'd disappeared so completely. He was still trying to rationalize what had happened when he saw the figure standing on the shoulder. Dale's headlights caught it for just a second before he flashed past. A person standing motionless beside the road, facing away from the traffic. He got an impression of dark clothing and pale skin, of someone who had no business being out there in the middle of nowhere at 2 a.m. Dale's foot moved toward the brake pedal, some instinct telling him he should stop and check, make sure the person wasn't in trouble. But another instinct, deeper and more primal, kept his foot on the accelerator. Something about the way that figure had been standing, so still and silent, made him want to put as much distance between them as possible. A mile later, he saw another one. Same thing, a figure standing on the shoulder, facing away from the road. This one was on the opposite side of the highway, and Dale caught a better look as he passed. It was a woman, or at least shaped like one, wearing what looked like a pale dress that hung down to her ankles. Her hair was long and dark, and she stood with her arms at her sides, not moving, not looking around, just standing there like she was waiting for something. Dale's heart started to pound. This wasn't right. People didn't just stand on the highway in the middle of the night, miles from any town or house, and they certainly didn't stand there facing the wrong way, ignoring the trucks that roared past them. He saw 3 more figures over the next 5 miles. Each one was standing on the shoulder, spaced out at irregular intervals. all of them facing away from the road. Men, women. It was hard to tell in the brief glimpses he got as his headlights swept over them. None of them moved. None of them turned to look at him as he passed. They just stood there, silent and still, like statues placed along the highway for some purpose he couldn't understand. Dale's hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles had turned white. He wanted to call someone, report what he was seeing, but the CB was useless and his cell phone showed no signal. He was alone out here with whatever this was, and all he could do was keep driving. The figures stopped appearing after mile marker 97. Dale kept watching for them, his eyes darting to the shoulders on both sides of the road, but the highway remained empty. The hills began to level out as he descended into flatter country, and gradually the tight feeling in his chest started to ease. Maybe it had been some kind of prank, he thought. Maybe there was a film crew out here shooting something and those had been actors. It was a thin explanation, and he didn't really believe it, but it was better than the alternative. Better than thinking about what those figures might have been if they weren't people. He reached the town of Lampasas just before 3 a.m. and pulled into an all-night truck stop, desperate for light and the presence of other human beings. The parking lot was half full, a dozen trucks idling in their spaces, and Dale backed into a spot near the building where he could keep an eye on his rig. Inside, the fluorescent lights were almost painfully bright after hours of darkness. A handful of drivers sat scattered around the dining area, nursing coffee and picking at plates of eggs and hash browns. Dale ordered coffee and a burger from the waitress, a tired-looking woman named Iris Mullen, whose name tag was pinned slightly crooked to her uniform, and sat down at a booth near the window where he could watch his truck. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Iris said when she brought his order. Her voice was friendly, but carried the practiced neutrality of someone who'd learned not to pry too much into driver's business. Dale managed a weak smile and wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, grateful for its warmth. "Long night," he said, and left it at that. Iris nodded like she understood and moved on to another table. Dale ate mechanically, not really tasting the food, his mind still replaying the image of those figures standing along the highway. He considered asking the other drivers if they'd seen anything unusual, but he couldn't figure out how to phrase the question without sounding crazy. He was finishing his coffee when an old mechanic named Tobin Weller shuffled in from the service bay, wiping grease off his hands with a red rag. Tobin had been working at this truck stop for as long as Dale had been running this route, and they'd exchanged greetings more than a few times over the years. The mechanic nodded at Dale and got himself a cup of coffee from the counter before ambling over to the booth. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, and Dale shook his head. Tobin eased himself down with a grunt and took a long sip of his coffee. "You come in off 281? he asked after a moment. Dale nodded. "Yeah, headed north from Austin." Tobin studied him for a moment, his weathered face unreadable. "See anything strange?" The question caught Dale off guard. He opened his mouth to deny it, then closed it again. Tobin's expression wasn't skeptical or mocking. It was serious, maybe even concerned. "Why do you ask?" Dale said carefully. Tobin shrugged and looked down at his coffee. "That stretch through the hills has been giving folks trouble lately. Some of the drivers have been saying things, seeing things. Figured if you came through there at night, you might have noticed something odd." Dale felt a chill run down his spine despite the warmth of the truck stop. "What kind of things?" he asked. Tobin took another sip of coffee, taking his time before answering. "People standing on the road. Headlights that follow you but never get closer. CB going dead for no reason. Started maybe 2 months ago. Handful of drivers reported it, but nobody wants to talk about it much. Makes you sound crazy." Dale stared at the mechanic, his burger forgotten. "I saw them," he said quietly. "The people on the road." 5 of them, just standing there in the middle of nowhere, facing away from the traffic. Tobin nodded slowly, like this was the confirmation of something he'd already suspected. "Yeah," he said. "That sounds about right. Nobody knows what it is. State police have been out there a few times, but they never find anything. One trooper said he drove that stretch twice in one night and didn't see a damn thing. But drivers keep reporting it, always the same story. Always at night, always between mile markers 70 and 100. Dale felt his stomach twist. "What do you think it is?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Tobin was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I don't know," he finally said. "But I'll tell you this. I've been working on trucks for 35 years. I've heard every kind of story you can imagine. Mechanical failures, weather disasters, drunk drivers, you name it. But this is different. This is something that doesn't want to be explained." They sat in silence for a while. The sounds of the truck stop washing over them. The clink of silverware, the low murmur of conversation, the distant rumble of idling engines. Normal sounds. Comforting sounds. Dale finished his coffee and stood up, suddenly exhausted. "I've got to get back on the road," he said. "Got a delivery to make." Tobin looked up at him and nodded. "You be careful out there," he said. "And if you see those lights again, don't stop. Don't try to figure it out. Just keep driving until you're clear of it." Dale promised he would, and paid his bill at the counter. As he walked back out to his truck, the cold night air hit him like a slap. He climbed into the cab and locked the doors, then sat there for a minute, staring out at the highway that stretched away into the darkness. He completed the rest of his run without incident. The highway stayed empty and normal, no mysterious lights, no figures standing on the shoulder. By the time he pulled into Amarillo just after dawn, Dale had almost convinced himself that the whole thing had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But then he checked his dash cam footage, scrolling back through the hours of recorded video, and his blood ran cold. The camera had captured everything. The lights that followed him for 20 miles appearing and disappearing like they existed in some space between frames. And the figures on the shoulder, they were there too. But the camera had caught something Dale hadn't seen while driving. Every one of them had been facing away from the road, just as he'd remembered. But in the brief moment when his headlights swept over them, their heads had turned. Not their bodies, just their heads, rotating impossibly far to look directly at his truck as it passed. And their faces, if you could call them that, were nothing but darkness. Empty spaces where eyes and mouths should have been. Dale downloaded the footage onto a thumb drive and filed a report with his company, though he wasn't sure what good it would do. He sent a copy to the state police and another to a friend who ran a truckers' forum online. Within a week, 3 other drivers had come forward with similar stories. They'd all driven Highway 281 through the hill country at night. They'd all seen the figures on the shoulder. And when they checked their dash cam footage, they'd all seen the same thing Dale had seen. Those heads turning to watch them pass. Those empty faces tracking their movement. The state police closed their investigation after finding no evidence of anything unusual. The official explanation was mass hysteria, drivers spooking each other with ghost stories. But Dale knew what he'd seen. He knew what his camera had recorded. And he knew one other thing with absolute certainty. He would never drive Highway 281 at night again. 2 months later, Dale heard through the trucker network that another driver had gone missing on that stretch of road. The guy had called in his position at mile marker 83, said everything was fine, said he was making good time. That was the last anyone heard from him. They found his truck 3 days later, parked on the shoulder near mile marker 95. The engine was still running. The driver's door was open. The cab was empty. The dash cam had been ripped out of its mount, the memory card missing. The only thing left behind was a coffee cup on the console, still half full, like the driver had just stepped out for a minute and would be right back. They searched the area for 2 weeks. Dogs, helicopters, volunteer searchers combing through the hills. They never found him, never found any sign of where he'd gone or what had happened to him. The truck was eventually towed to an impound lot, and the case went cold. Dale heard about it from Tobin Weller, who called him one night just to check in. "You remember what we talked about?" the mechanic asked. "About that stretch of road?" Dale said he did, and Tobin told him about the missing driver. "They're saying he probably wandered off and got lost," Tobin said. "Had a medical emergency maybe, heat stroke or something, but I don't buy it. Weather was mild that week and this guy was experienced. 20 years on the road. He wouldn't just wander off into the brush for no reason." Dale didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. They both knew what had probably happened, even if they couldn't prove it. Even if saying it out loud would make them sound insane. "You still running that route?" Tobin asked after a pause. Dale shook his head, then remembered the mechanic couldn't see him. "No," he said. "I rerouted all my northern runs. Taking 35 now, even though it adds 3 hours. Don't care. I'm not going back on 281. Tobin made a sound of approval. "Smart," he said. "Real smart. I've been telling folks the same thing. There's something wrong with that road, Dale. Something that doesn't want to be known. And the folks who try to figure it out, they don't come back." They talked for a few more minutes, but there wasn't much else to say. After they hung up, Dale sat in his living room, nursing a beer and staring at nothing. His daughter was upstairs doing homework. His wife was reading in the bedroom. Normal life, normal sounds. But Dale couldn't stop thinking about that missing driver. Couldn't stop wondering what he'd seen in those last moments before he vanished. Sometimes, late at night when sleep wouldn't come, Dale would pull up the dashcam footage on his laptop and watch it again. He'd studied those figures frame by frame, trying to understand what they were. But there was no understanding it. They existed in a space beyond explanation, beyond logic. All he knew for certain was that they were waiting out there on Highway 281, standing on the shoulder in the darkness, watching for the next truck that came through. And when the right one came along, when conditions were just right, they would take whoever was behind the wheel. Take them somewhere that wasn't on any map. Somewhere the light didn't reach. Dale had been lucky. He'd driven through and come out the other side, but he'd never forgotten what he'd seen, and he knew with absolute certainty that he'd never be that lucky again. The road had let him go once. It wouldn't make the same mistake twice. So he stayed away from Highway 281. He told other drivers to do the same, though most of them didn't listen. They thought he was exaggerating, telling tall tales to spook the rookies. But every few months he'd hear about another driver who'd had a strange experience on that road. Lights following them. Figures standing on the shoulder. CB going dead. And occasionally someone else would go missing. Their truck found abandoned, engine running, door open. No trace of where they'd gone. The official reports would call it unexplained. Say the driver must have had some kind of breakdown. But Dale knew better. He knew the road was taking them, one by one. And he knew that someday, maybe years from now, someone would figure out what was happening on Highway 281. Maybe they'd find the missing drivers. Maybe they'd find answers. But until then, the only smart thing to do was stay away. Let the road have its secrets. Let it keep whatever it had taken. Because some mysteries weren't meant to be solved, and some roads weren't meant to be driven. Not at night, not alone. Not when something was waiting in the darkness, patient and hungry, watching for the next set of headlights to come around the bend. The wind was what Eldon Frey noticed first. Not unusual for Oklahoma in late November, but this was different. It wasn't just blowing, it was screaming, tearing across the flat emptiness of the panhandle like something alive and furious. The kind of wind that made your rig shudder even at highway speed, that threw tumbleweeds and debris across all 4 lanes without warning. Eldon had his hands locked tight on the wheel, fighting to keep his trailer from fishtailing, when he saw the green sign reflecting in his headlights. Rest area, mile 64, 2 miles. He'd driven past that rest stop 100 times and never once stopped there. It had a reputation, nothing specific, just a general understanding among drivers that you kept moving. But tonight, with the wind trying to push him into the ditch and his eyes burning from 10 straight hours behind the wheel, Eldon decided to break his own rule. The rest area sat about 200 yards off the highway, connected by a curved access road that led down into a shallow depression in the landscape. That was probably why they'd built it there, to give travelers some protection from the wind. As Eldon took the exit, the gusts immediately lessened, blocked by the rise of land on either side. It was still blowing hard, but at least his truck wasn't rocking anymore. The parking lot appeared ahead, lit by sodium vapor lights that cast everything in shades of sickly yellow and deep shadow. There were 3 other vehicles present when he pulled in. A silver sedan parked near the restroom building, its windows dark. An RV with Texas plates taking up 2 spaces on the far end. And a pickup truck sitting by itself near the information kiosk, idling, exhaust visible in the cold air. Eldon chose a spot in the middle, backing his rig into the space so he could make a quick exit if needed. Old habit, never park nose in unless you absolutely have to. He killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the wind howl around his cab. The sodium lights flickered occasionally, creating brief moments of deeper darkness. Through his windshield he could see the restroom building, a squat concrete structure with those narrow horizontal windows set high in the walls. The kind of windows designed to let in light but prevent anyone from seeing in or out. The door to the men's room was propped open with a rubber wedge, swinging slightly in the wind. Eldon grabbed his jacket and his keys and climbed down from the cab. The wind hit him immediately, colder than he'd expected, cutting through his jacket like it wasn't there. He zipped it up to his chin and hurried toward the building, head down, not really looking at anything except the patch of ground in front of his feet. The restroom was empty and smelled like industrial cleaner and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that Eldon couldn't quite identify. The lights hummed overhead. Fluorescent tubes behind plastic panels yellowed with age. Everything was tile and concrete, surfaces that echoed every sound. Eldon used the facilities quickly, washed his hands in water that came out rust-colored for the first few seconds, and was about to leave when he heard the voice. It was coming from outside, a woman's voice, high and strained. At first he thought it was just the wind creating an audible illusion, the way it sometimes did when it blew through power lines or gaps in buildings. But then he heard it again, and this time there were words. "Help me, please. Somebody help me." The voice was coming from somewhere near the parking lot, maybe from the direction of that silver sedan. Eldon pushed through the door and stepped back into the wind. It had picked up even more, if that was possible, and he had to lean into it just to stay upright. "Hello?" he called out. "Where are you?" No answer, just the wind and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. Eldon walked toward the sedan, his boots crunching on gravel. As he got closer, he could see that the windows weren't just dark, they were covered from the inside. Blankets or towels, something blocking any view into the vehicle. The front door was slightly ajar, interior light off. "Hello?" Eldon called again. "You need help?" Still nothing. He reached for the door handle, his fingers an inch away from the metal, when something made him stop. Not a sound or a sight, just a feeling. The same feeling he used to get in Afghanistan when they were on patrol and something wasn't right. that primal instinct that had kept him alive when logic and training had failed. Eldon stepped back from the sedan and looked around the parking lot more carefully. The RV hadn't moved. Its windows were dark, no signs of life. The pickup truck was still idling, still sitting by the information kiosk. As Eldon watched, its headlights flicked on, then off again. On, off, 3 times, deliberate, like a signal. Eldon's hand moved to his pocket, where he kept a folding knife. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. He started backing toward his truck, keeping his eyes on the sedan and the pickup, trying to watch both at once. The woman's voice came again, closer this time, almost right behind him. "Help me. Please, I'm so cold." Eldon spun around. Nothing there, just empty parking lot and his truck 30 feet away. When he turned back, the sedan's door was fully open now, though he hadn't heard it move. The interior was completely dark, like it was filled with shadow that light couldn't penetrate. He ran. Didn't think about it, didn't try to rationalize, just turned and ran for his truck, fishing his keys out of his pocket as he went. Behind him, he heard other doors opening, car doors and truck doors, the sound multiplying until it seemed like a dozen vehicles were opening at once. Footsteps on gravel, except they didn't sound like footsteps. They sounded like something heavier, something that didn't walk so much as drag itself forward. Eldon reached his cab and yanked the door open, threw himself inside, and hit the lock button. His hands were shaking as he jammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned over once, twice, then caught. He threw the rig into drive without checking his mirrors and stomped on the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning on loose gravel before finding traction. In his side mirror, Eldon caught a glimpse of figures emerging from the shadows between vehicles. They moved wrong, jerky and disjointed, like they were being operated by someone who didn't quite understand how human bodies worked. He didn't look back again, just focused on getting to the access road, getting back to the highway, getting away from whatever that place was. The wind seemed to fight him as he drove, pushing against his truck like it wanted to force him back into the rest area. But Eldon kept his foot down and his hands steady, and 30 seconds later he was back on the highway, merging into the westbound lane with more speed than was probably safe. He drove for another hour before he was calm enough to think clearly. His heart was still pounding, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cold. He picked up his CB and called out on Channel 19, looking for any driver who might be in the area. "This is westbound on 54, just past that rest area at mile 64. Anybody else out here?" Static answered him for a long moment. Then a crackling voice came through. "Yeah, I got you. This is eastbound, about 10 miles out. What's up?" Eldon keyed the mic, choosing his words carefully. "You ever stop at that rest area, the one at mile 64? Another pause. "Hell no. That place has been trouble for years. Why, you stopped there?" Eldon explained what had happened, or tried to. It sounded crazy, even as he was saying it. Voices asking for help. Doors opening by themselves. Figures that moved like broken puppets. The other driver listened without interrupting, and when Eldon finished, there was a long silence on the channel. "You still there?" Eldon asked. "Yeah," the other driver said finally. "I'm here. Listen, you're not the first person to report something like that. Been hearing stories about that rest stop for maybe 5, 6 years now. Different details, but always the same basic thing. Something wrong with the place. Something that doesn't want you to leave. What is it?" Eldon asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Nobody knows for sure," the other driver said. "Some folks say it's haunted. Some say there's people using it as a trap, luring drivers in to rob them. Some say it's something worse. I don't know what the truth is, but I know enough to stay away, and I tell every driver I meet to do the same. If you're smart, you won't go back." Eldon promised he wouldn't and signed off. He drove for another 3 hours before pulling into a truck stop near the Kansas border, a well-lit place with security cameras and an actual security guard walking the lot. Even then, he had trouble sleeping. Every time he started to drift off, he'd hear that voice in his head. "Help me. Please, I'm so cold." And he'd see those figures emerging from the shadows, moving in that broken, wrong way. The next morning, Eldon called the Oklahoma Highway Patrol and filed a report. He told them everything, expecting them to dismiss it as the delusions of a tired driver. But the trooper who took his statement didn't sound surprised. "Rest area at mile 64?" the trooper asked. "Yeah, we've had reports about that location. Nothing we can substantiate, but enough complaints that we've increased patrols in the area." Eldon asked what kind of complaints, and the trooper hesitated before answering. People seeing things, hearing things. A couple of drivers said they stopped there, and when they tried to leave, their vehicles wouldn't start. Another guy said he went into the restroom, and when he came out, his truck had moved. Not far, just a few feet, but he swears he'd set the parking brake. And then there was the incident last year. "What incident?" Eldon asked. The trooper was quiet for a moment. Woman disappeared from that rest area. Young, maybe mid-20s, traveling alone. Her car was found parked there with the door open and her belongings still inside. Phone, wallet, everything. We searched the area for weeks. Used dogs, helicopters, the whole works. Never found a trace of her. Case is still open, but after a year, with no leads, he trailed off, and Eldon felt his stomach clench. "You think something happened to her there?" he asked. "I think that rest area has a problem," the trooper said carefully. "Whether it's transients or vandals or something else, I couldn't say. But I can tell you that if I broke down on that stretch of highway, I'd call for a tow before I'd pull into that rest stop, and I'd advise you to do the same." Eldon thanked him and ended the call. He sat in his truck for a long time after that, staring at nothing, trying to make sense of what had happened. He'd been in dangerous situations before. He'd served 2 tours in a war zone, had seen things that most people couldn't imagine. But this was different. This wasn't an enemy you could identify or a threat you could quantify. This was something that existed outside the normal rules, something that didn't care about logic or reason. He thought about that woman who'd disappeared, wondered if she'd heard that voice too, calling for help, wondered if she'd gone to investigate, trying to do the right thing, and found herself pulled into whatever darkness inhabited that place. Over the next few weeks, Eldon started asking other drivers about the rest area. He'd bring it up casually in truck stops and over the CB, just mentioning that he'd stopped there and it had seemed off. The responses were consistent. Nobody wanted to talk about it directly, but everyone had heard something. A driver who'd stopped there in 2019 and found his trailer door open when he came back from the restroom, even though he'd locked it. Another who'd seen someone standing by the information kiosk, motionless, at 3 a.m. A woman who'd pulled in during a snowstorm and heard children laughing from somewhere in the darkness, even though there were no other vehicles in the lot. All of them had the same advice. Don't stop there. Don't even slow down. Just keep driving until you're well past it. Eldon learned that there was an informal network of drivers who tracked problem locations, places where things happened that couldn't be easily explained. The rest area at mile 64 was near the top of their list, along with a truck stop in West Texas where drivers reported seeing a woman in a white dress walking the lot at night, and a stretch of highway in New Mexico where electronics would fail for no reason. These weren't places that made the news or got official recognition. They existed in the margins, talked about in whispers and warning avoided by those who knew better. Eldon added his experience to the collective knowledge and made a mental note to steer clear of all the locations on that list. Some roads were bad because of weather or poor maintenance. Others were bad because of accidents or crime. But a few, just a few, were bad for reasons that couldn't be put into a report or explained to someone who hadn't experienced it themselves. 3 months after his encounter, Eldon was running the same route through Oklahoma. It was a clear night, no wind, perfect conditions. As he approached mile marker 62, he saw the rest area sign reflecting in his headlights. He kept his foot steady on the accelerator, eyes fixed on the road ahead, not even glancing at the exit. But as he passed, something made him look in his side mirror. Just a quick glance, lasting maybe a second. The rest area was lit up as always, the sodium vapor lights casting their yellow glow over the empty lot. Except it wasn't empty. There were vehicles parked there now, maybe a dozen of them, sedans and trucks and RVs. And standing between them, visible even at this distance, were figures just standing there, motionless, facing the highway, watching the traffic pass, waiting for someone to take the exit. Eldon looked away and focused on the road. He didn't tell anyone what he'd seen. Didn't file another report or mention it on the CB. What was the point? The people who needed to know already did, and the people who didn't believe wouldn't be convinced by another story. He just kept driving, putting miles between himself and that place, and tried not to think about what might have happened if he hadn't listened to his instincts that night. If he'd opened that sedan door, if he'd gone looking for the source of that voice, he might have found her, whoever she was, or whatever was pretending to be her, and then he might have become another story that drivers told in hushed voices at truck stops. Another warning to stay away from mile 64. Another person who'd stopped at the wrong place and never left. Sometimes, late at night, when the highway was empty and his mind started to wander, Eldon would think about that missing woman, the one who'd disappeared from the rest area. He'd wonder if she was still there somehow, trapped in whatever space that place occupied. He'd wonder if she was the voice calling for help, or if something else was using her voice, using her memory to lure in more victims. There was no way to know, no way to find out without going back, and Eldon had no intention of ever doing that. He'd been lucky once. He'd felt that warning instinct and listened to it. Not everyone was that lucky. Some people ignored their instincts. Some people were too tired or too stubborn or too convinced of their own safety to recognize danger when it was standing right in front of them. The rest area at mile 64 was still there, still open, still marked on maps and GPS systems as a place to stop and rest. The state hadn't closed it or put up warning signs. Officially, there was nothing wrong with it. Just another rest area on another highway, maintained and cleaned according to schedule. But the drivers knew better. They knew to keep driving, to wait for the next exit, to never let themselves be lured in by the promise of a quick break. They knew that some places weren't meant for the living, that some darkness couldn't be lit with sodium vapor lights or chased away with concrete and tile. They knew, and they warned each other, and they hoped that would be enough. But it never was, because every few months someone new would take that exit. Someone who hadn't heard the stories or didn't believe them. Someone who was too tired to care or too desperate to be cautious, and the rest area would claim another victim. Eldon never learned their names, never heard their stories. He just knew that the list of missing persons connected to that location kept growing, one by one, with no explanations and no remains ever found. The state troopers would investigate, file their reports, and eventually close the cases as cold. The families would never get answers. The rest area would stay open, and the cycle would continue night after night, mile marker 64 waiting patiently for the next set of headlights to turn off the highway and come down that access road into the depression, where the wind couldn't reach, and the light didn't penetrate the shadows between vehicles. Eldon thought about it sometimes. Thought about organizing a group to go back there, to figure out what was really happening, to maybe save whoever could still be saved. But he never did, because deep down, he knew the truth. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. Some places weren't meant to be understood, and some darkness was better left alone, avoided, warned about, but never confronted directly. The rest area at mile 64 would still be there long after Eldon retired from trucking. It would be there when his truck had been replaced 10 times over. It would be there when the highway itself was rebuilt or rerouted or abandoned, because places like that didn't follow normal rules. They existed outside of time and logic, pockets of wrongness that had somehow opened up in the world and refused to close. You could avoid them, but you couldn't destroy them. You could warn people, but you couldn't protect everyone. All you could do was remember. Remember what you'd seen and heard. Remember that feeling of primal fear that had saved your life, and remember to never, ever go back. Eldon still drives that route through Oklahoma, but now he makes sure he has enough fuel to skip that section entirely without stopping. He plans his brakes around it, timing things so he's either well ahead or well behind mile marker 64 when he needs to pull over. It adds time to his runs and costs him money and efficiency, but it's worth it, because he knows what's waiting there in that rest area, standing between the vehicles in the yellow sodium light. He knows, and he's not interested in finding out anything more about it. Some knowledge comes at too high a price, and some questions have answers that will drive you insane if you learn them. The wind still screams across the Oklahoma Panhandle on cold November nights. The rest area still sits in its little depression, protected from the worst of the gusts, lit by its flickering yellow lights. The buildings are still maintained, the restrooms still cleaned, the information kiosk still stocked with maps and brochures, and the voices still call out in the darkness, pleading for help, begging for someone to stop, to investigate, to come just a little bit closer. Most drivers pass by without noticing, but a few, tired and desperate and unlucky, take that exit. They pull into the lot and park between the other vehicles. They walk to the restroom or the picnic area or just stand outside their trucks, stretching their legs and breathing the cold night air. And then, when conditions are right, when the moment comes, they hear it. That voice calling for help, that promise of someone in need, that irresistible pull to be a hero, to do the right thing, to investigate what's wrong. And then they're gone. Just another missing person report, another cold case, another name on a list that grows longer every year, with no suspects, no evidence, no explanation that makes any sense to anyone who hasn't stood in that parking lot and felt the wrongness emanating from every shadow. Russell Pike had been hauling refrigerated goods across the Midwest for 12 years, and in all that time he'd never had trouble with his CB radio. The thing was a lifeline out on the long hauls, your connection to other drivers, your early warning system for accidents and speed traps and bad weather. Russell kept his tune to Channel 19 most of the time, listening to the steady chatter of truckers calling out their positions and swapping information. It was company of a sort. Voices in the darkness that reminded you that you weren't completely alone out there on the empty highways. He'd heard plenty of strange things over the CB over the years. Drivers who claimed to see UFOs, others who swore they'd encountered ghosts or cryptids. Russell had always taken those stories with a grain of salt, figured most of them were just bored drivers entertaining themselves or trying to spook the rookies. But that changed on a cold February night on a nothing stretch of highway along the Kansas-Colorado border. The load was routine. 26 pallets of frozen vegetables headed from a distribution center in Dodge City to a grocery chain warehouse in Denver. Russell had made the run dozens of times, knew every truck stop and way station along the way. He'd left Kansas just after 7 p.m., planning to drive straight through and arrive in Denver by morning. The weather was cooperating, clear and cold, with no precipitation in the forecast. His reefer unit was running smoothly, maintaining a steady 32 degrees, and his fuel gauge showed 3/4 of a tank. Everything was in order. Russell settled into the familiar rhythm of highway driving, his hands loose on the wheel, his eyes scanning the road ahead, while his mind wandered through plans for his next day off. The CB crackled with occasional transmissions, someone warning about a disabled vehicle on I-70, another driver asking for a radio check. Normal chatter, background noise that was more comforting than distracting. Around 9:30 p.m., somewhere between mile marker 30 and 40, the CB crackled with a transmission that made Russell sit up straighter. The voice was male, calm, and measured, with an accent Russell couldn't quite place. Not Southern, not Midwestern, something else. "Westbound reefer truck approaching mile marker 35, the voice said. "You're going to want to check your trailer. I think you've got a problem with your refrigeration unit." Russell frowned and glanced at his temperature gauge. Everything looked normal. He keyed his mic. "This is the westbound reefer. Who's this and how do you know what I'm hauling?" No response, just static. Russell tried again. "Unknown caller. Please identify yourself." "You got eyes on my truck?" Still nothing. He checked his mirrors, looking for any vehicles that might be pacing him, but the highway behind him was empty. Ahead, the road stretched out under the glow of a half moon, pale and deserted. Russell let it go and returned his attention to driving. Probably just some driver messing around, he thought. Maybe someone who'd passed him earlier and noticed the reefer trailer. Nothing to worry about. But 15 minutes later, the voice came back. "Westbound reefer, you really should pull over and check that unit. Temperature's climbing. You're going to lose your whole load if you don't address it soon." This time, there was something in the voice that made Russell's skin prickle. Not threatening exactly, but insistent. Certain. Like whoever was speaking knew something Russell didn't. He checked his temperature gauge again, still holding steady at 32 degrees. The reefer unit was humming along normally. No warning lights, no unusual sounds. Everything seemed fine. But just to be safe, Russell pulled up the trailer monitoring app on his phone and checked the readings there. Temperature, fuel level, run hours, all normal. Nothing to indicate any problem. "Unknown caller," Russell said into the CB. "I'm showing normal temps on my reefer. Everything looks good on my end. You want to explain how you know what my trailer temperature is?" Again, no response. Russell was starting to get annoyed. This wasn't funny anymore, if it ever had been. He cycled through the CB channels, listening for any sign of the voice on other frequencies, but found nothing. Channel 19 was back to its normal traffic. Drivers talking about road conditions and fuel prices. No one mentioned hearing any unusual transmissions. Russell was about to write the whole thing off as some kind of radio anomaly when his phone buzzed with an alert. Temperature variance detected in cargo zone. Russell grabbed the phone and looked at the screen. According to the monitoring app, the temperature in his trailer had jumped to 38 degrees. He looked at his dashboard gauge, still reading 32, but the app didn't lie. It pulled data directly from sensors in the trailer, independent of the cab display. Russell muttered a curse and started looking for a place to pull over. This stretch of highway didn't have much in the way of shoulders, just narrow strips of gravel on either side of the lanes, but he found a spot near mile marker 40 that looked wide enough and eased his rig onto it. He put on his hazard lights, set the parking brake, and climbed out into the cold night air. The wind had picked up, blowing from the west with enough force to make him zip his jacket all the way up. He walked back to the trailer, pulling out his flashlight and inspection keys. The reefer unit was mounted on the front of the trailer, a big diesel-powered refrigeration system that should have been running continuously. But as Russell approached it, he realized he couldn't hear it. No engine noise, no fan noise, nothing. The unit was completely silent. He climbed up onto the narrow platform beside the unit and opened the access panel. The engine was warm, like it had been running recently, but it wasn't running now. He checked the fuel tank. Full. He checked the electrical connections. All secure. He tried the manual start button. The engine turned over once, coughed, and died. Russell tried again. Same result. Something was wrong, but he couldn't figure out what. The unit had been serviced 2 weeks ago and had passed all its inspections. There was no reason for it to just shut down like this. He climbed back down and pulled out his phone to call his company's maintenance line. That's when the CB crackled again, the voice coming through so clearly it might have been standing right next to him. "You should get back in your truck, Russell, right now." Russell froze. The voice had used his name. He looked around, suddenly very aware of how isolated this stretch of highway was. No other vehicles in sight, no buildings, no lights except his own hazards flashing in the darkness. Just empty road and flat scrubland stretching away in all directions. "Who is this?" Russell demanded, speaking to his CB even though he was standing outside his truck. "How do you know my name?" The voice responded immediately, like it could hear him even without a mic. "That doesn't matter right now. What matters is that you need to get in your truck and lock the doors. There's someone in your trailer." Russell's blood ran cold. He looked at the trailer doors, big steel panels secured with a padlock and a security seal. Both were intact, undisturbed. "My trailer's locked," he said. "Nobody could get in there without breaking the seal." "Check your manifest," the voice said. "How many pallets were you loaded with?" Russell didn't need to check. He knew the number by heart. 26 pallets, 1,600 pounds each. "Wyatt?" The voice paused, and when it spoke again there was something almost apologetic in its tone. "Count them." Russell felt his stomach drop. He didn't want to open that trailer. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to get back in his truck and drive away. But he had to know. He had to see. He walked to the back of the trailer, his boots crunching on gravel, and unlocked the padlock with hands that had started to shake. The security seal broke with a crack that seemed too loud in the quiet night. Russell grabbed the handle and pulled the door open. Cold air rushed out, carrying with it the smell of frozen vegetables and something else, something organic and wrong. He shined his flashlight into the trailer. 26 pallets of vegetables, stacked and secured just as they should be. Nothing out of place. Nothing obviously wrong. But as Russell moved the light across the load, he noticed something. There was space at the back of the trailer, a gap between the last pallet and the doors where nothing should be. Russell climbed up into the trailer, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The pallets were all there. He counted them twice to be sure. But they'd been moved, shifted forward about 3 feet, creating that empty space at the back. And in that space, partially hidden behind the last pallet, was a sleeping bag and a backpack. Someone had been in his trailer. Someone had been hiding back here probably since the load was sealed back in Dodge City. Russell's first thought was an illegal border crossing. Someone trying to hitch a ride to avoid checkpoints. But that didn't make sense. This route didn't go near any borders. His second thought was robbery. Someone planning to steal part of the load once they reached their destination. But that didn't make sense either. Who would risk hypothermia to steal frozen vegetables? He was backing toward the doors, ready to get out and call the police, when he heard the CB again. The voice was urgent now, almost panicked. "Russell, get out of the trailer. Get out now." Russell didn't need to be told twice. He jumped down from the trailer and slammed the doors shut, fumbling with the lock. Behind him, he heard something move inside the trailer, not the creak of shifting cargo. Something else. Something that sounded like footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving from the back of the trailer toward the front. Russell locked the doors and ran for his cab. He threw himself into the driver's seat and locked the doors behind him, his heart hammering in his chest. The CB was crackling with static, and then the voice came through again. "Listen to me carefully. You need to drive to the nearest truck stop and call the police. Do not open that trailer again. Do not stop for anything. Just drive." "Who are you?" Russell demanded, grabbing the mic. "How do you know what's happening?" The voice ignored his questions. "There's a truck stop 8 miles west of your position. You can make it in 10 minutes if you hurry. Drive there. Call the police. Tell them you've got a stowaway in your trailer, and tell them to bring backup. Tell them to bring a lot of backup." The transmission ended with a burst of static, and then the channel went dead. Russell tried to raise the voice again, cycling through every channel on his CB, but got no response. The radio was working. He could hear other drivers talking on Channel 19, but the voice that had warned him was gone. Russell sat there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Part of him wanted to open the trailer again, to see if he'd really heard footsteps, or if his mind had been playing tricks on him. But a larger part, the part that had kept him alive and safe for 12 years on the road, told him to listen to the voice, to drive. He put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway. The reefer unit was still dead, and his cargo was warming up with every minute that passed, but he didn't care. He just wanted to get to somewhere with lights and people and cell phone service. The 8 miles to the truck stop felt like 80. Russell kept checking his mirrors, half expecting to see the trailer doors swing open and someone climb out. But they stayed closed, the locks holding. He passed one other truck headed east, and for a moment he considered flagging it down, getting help. But what would he say? That he had someone in his trailer based on the word of a disembodied voice on his CB? They'd think he was crazy. Hell, he was starting to think he was crazy. The truck stop appeared ahead, a cluster of lights in the darkness. Russell had never been so happy to see a flying J in his life. He pulled into the lot and parked in a space directly under one of the big overhead lights, then grabbed his phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered on the second ring, and Russell explained the situation as calmly as he could. He'd found evidence of a stowaway in his trailer. The trailer was locked and secure. He needed police assistance. The dispatcher told him to stay in his cab and keep his doors locked. Units were being dispatched and would arrive within 15 minutes. Russell thanked her and ended the call, then sat there watching his trailer in the mirror and waiting. Other drivers walked past his truck, heading into the building or back to their rigs, completely unaware of what might be hiding in his cargo. Russell thought about warning them, but decided against it. The police were coming. Let them handle it. The first patrol car arrived 12 minutes later, followed quickly by 2 more. 6 officers approached Russell's truck, and he climbed down to meet them. He explained everything again, showed them the broken security seal, told them about the sleeping bag and backpack. One of the officers, a sheriff's deputy named Clint Aubrey, asked him if he'd heard anything else from the trailer since he'd locked it. Russell said he hadn't. The cargo area was refrigerated and essentially soundproof from the outside. If someone was in there, they couldn't communicate with the outside world. Deputy Aubrey nodded and conferred with the other officers. They positioned themselves around the trailer, hands on their weapons, and told Russell to step back. "Stay by your cab," Aubrey said. "If this goes bad, you get inside and lock the doors. Understand?" Russell nodded and retreated to a safe distance. Aubrey approached the trailer doors and knocked on them hard enough to make the steel ring. "This is the sheriff's department," he called out. "If there's anyone in this trailer, you need to make yourself known right now. You're not in trouble. We just need to talk to you." Silence. The deputy waited a full minute, then knocked again. "Last chance," he said. "We're opening these doors in 30 seconds. If you're in there, sit down and keep your hands visible." Still no response. Aubrey signaled to another officer who brought bolt cutters from his patrol car and snipped through the new padlock Russell had put on. The officers took positions on either side of the doors, weapons drawn. Aubrey grabbed the handle, counted to 3, and pulled the door open. Cold air rushed out, and for a moment nobody moved. Then one of the officers shined a flashlight into the trailer, sweeping it across the pallets of frozen vegetables. "Clear," he said after a moment. "Nobody here." Russell felt his stomach drop. That wasn't possible. He'd seen the sleeping bag, he'd heard the footsteps. He pushed forward, ignoring Aubrey's order to stay back, and climbed up into the trailer. The officers let him, probably figuring he wasn't a threat. Russell made his way to the back of the trailer, shining his own flashlight into the space behind the last pallet. Empty, no sleeping bag, no backpack, nothing. Just bare floor and cold air. "I saw it," Russell said, his voice shaking. "It was right here. Someone was in my trailer." Aubrey climbed up beside him and examined the space carefully. "No signs anyone's been in here," he said. "No footprints, no disturbed cargo. You sure about what you saw?" Russell wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he knew what he'd seen. But looking at that empty space, he wasn't sure anymore. Maybe his mind had been playing tricks on him. Maybe the stress of the dead reefer unit and that creepy voice on the CB had made him see things that weren't there. The officers searched the entire trailer, checking behind every pallet, looking for any evidence that someone had been hiding in there. They found nothing. No sleeping bag, no backpack, no signs of forced entry or tampering. The pallets hadn't been moved. There was no 3-foot gap at the back. Everything was exactly as it should have been when the trailer was loaded. Deputy Aubrey took Russell's statement and made notes about the dead reefer unit and the mysterious CB transmission, but Russell could tell the man thought he was either mistaken or making things up. "You been on the road long today?" Aubrey asked. "Maybe 12, 13 hours, Russell admitted. "Long enough to be tired, long enough for your eyes to start playing tricks." Aubrey nodded like that explained everything. "Why don't you get some rest?" he suggested. "We'll file a report about the CB transmission, see if we can track down who was messing with you. But as far as your trailer goes, I think you're clear." The officers left, and Russell was alone again. He climbed back into his cab and sat there, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had he really seen that sleeping bag and backpack? Had he really heard footsteps? Or had the voice on the CB planted the idea in his head, made him see and hear things that weren't there? He didn't know. All he knew for certain was that his reefer unit was dead, his cargo was warming up, and he needed to figure out his next move. He called his dispatcher and explained the situation. The company sent a mobile repair tech who arrived an hour later. The tech looked over the reefer unit, ran diagnostics, and finally shook his head. "This is weird," the tech said. "Your compressor relay is disconnected, like someone manually pulled the wire, but the access panel shows no signs of tampering, and I can't figure out how someone would reach it without the right tools and knowledge." "Can you fix it?" Russell asked. The tech reconnected the relay and tested the unit. It started up immediately, running smoothly like nothing had ever been wrong. "Fixed," he said. "But I'd keep an eye on it. This kind of thing doesn't usually happen by accident." Russell thanked him and paid the service fee. By the time everything was sorted out, it was almost 3 a.m. His cargo temperature had climbed to 45 degrees, borderline for food safety, and he had to report the incident to his company and the receiver. They ended up rejecting the load as potentially compromised, and Russell had to haul it back to the distribution center for inspection. It cost him 2 days and a significant hit to his safety rating. But worse than any of that was the lingering sense that something was wrong, that the voice on the CB had been warning him about something real, even if the police couldn't find any evidence of it. Over the following weeks, Russell tried to learn more about what had happened that night. He reached out to other drivers, asking if anyone else had experienced weird CB transmissions on that stretch of highway. A few had. They described a voice that seemed to know too much, that would warn them about problems before they happened, or direct them away from certain routes. Some drivers thought it was helpful, a guardian angel of sorts. Others found it deeply unsettling. One driver, a woman named Cora Van, who ran fuel tankers, told Russell about an experience she'd had 6 months earlier. She'd been driving the same route when the voice came on her CB and told her to pull over immediately. She did, and while she was parked, a drunk driver plowed through the exact spot where she would have been if she'd kept going. The voice had saved her life. "But here's the thing," Cora said over the coffee at a truck stop. "I tried to thank whoever it was, tried to raise them on the CB. Nothing. And when I reported it to the police, they couldn't find any record of the transmission, like it never happened. The only proof I have is that I'm still alive." Russell asked if she'd ever heard the voice again. "Once," Cora said. "About a month ago. It told me to check my tire pressure. I thought it was being paranoid, but I checked anyway. One of my trailer tires was down to 30 psi, slow leak. Could have blown at highway speed if I hadn't caught it. So yeah, I listen when the voice talks. I don't know what it is or how it knows things, but I trust it more than I trust most people." Russell understood. He'd spent weeks trying to rationalize what happened that night, trying to convince himself it was all a misunderstanding. But deep down, he knew better. Something had been in his trailer. The voice had known about it. And somehow, whatever it was had vanished before the police arrived, leaving no trace of its presence. He started listening to the CB more carefully after that, paying attention not just to the chatter, but to the spaces between transmissions, waiting for that voice to come back. It took 2 months, but eventually it did. Russell was running a load through Kansas, different route but same general area, when the voice crackled through his speaker. "Westbound reefer. This is Jericho Lang. You remember me?" Russell grabbed his mic, his heart racing. "I remember. You're the one who warned me about my trailer." The voice, Jericho Lang apparently, responded with what might have been amusement. "That's right. I wanted to check in. Make sure you're being more careful these days." Russell had 1,000 questions, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Who are you? How do you know things before they happen?" Lang was quiet for a moment. "I'm someone who watches the roads, someone who sees things that others miss. And I know things because I pay attention, that's all." "What was in my trailer that night?" Russell asked. "What did you save me from?" Another pause, longer this time. When Lang spoke again, his voice had lost its casual tone. "Something that shouldn't have been there. Something that was using your trailer to get where it needed to go. If you'd let it, if you'd opened those doors when it wanted you to, it would have taken you instead. So you're welcome." The transmission ended before Russell could respond. He tried to raise Lang again, but got no answer. He asked other drivers if anyone else had heard that exchange, but nobody had. It was like the conversation had happened on a private channel that only Russell could access. He never heard from Jericho Lang again after that night. The voice that had saved him, that had somehow known he was in danger, vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. Russell continued driving that route, continued hauling refrigerated loads across the Midwest. But he was more careful now, more aware. He checked his cargo before sealing his trailer. He verified that his reefer unit was running properly. He paid attention to his instincts, and late at night, when the highways were empty and the CB was quiet, he'd sometimes key his mic and call out into the darkness. "Jericho Lang, you out there? Got ears on?" No answer ever came, just static and the distant chatter of other drivers going about their runs. But Russell kept calling anyway, kept listening, because he knew that somewhere out there, someone was watching. Someone was paying attention, and if he was lucky, if he ever needed help again, that voice would come back, would warn him, would save him from whatever dangers lurked in the spaces between the lights, in the dark stretches of highway where anything could happen, and nobody would know until it was too late. Russell Pike never found out who or what Jericho Lang really was. Never learned how the voice could predict things before they happened, or know details that should have been impossible to know. All he knew was that he owed his life to a disembodied voice on a CB radio, and that some mysteries were better left unsolved. Warren Cade didn't believe in UFOs. He'd driven through New Mexico more times than he could count, crossed that vast emptiness where the sky stretched forever, and the land looked like something from another planet, and he'd never seen anything he couldn't explain. Sure, there were military installations out there, test ranges and restricted areas where strange things sometimes happened, but it was all terrestrial, all explainable. People who claimed to see alien spacecraft were usually looking at weather balloons or military aircraft, or, more often, their own tired eyes playing tricks on them after too many hours behind the wheel. Warren had been hauling freight for 22 years, and he'd learned to distinguish between the strange and the supernatural. The world was weird enough without inventing extra weirdness to worry about. At least, that's what he believed until a September night on Route 50, when the sky above him did something that broke every rule he thought he understood. The run had started normally enough. Warren picked up a load of industrial equipment in Albuquerque, 42,000 pounds of machinery bound for a mining operation outside of Ely, Nevada. The route took him northwest through some of the emptiest country in the lower 48, hundreds of miles where you might go an hour without seeing another vehicle. Warren didn't mind. He actually preferred these isolated runs, the ones where you could set the cruise control and let your mind wander without worrying about traffic or congestion. The weather was perfect, clear skies and mild temperatures, and his truck was running smoothly. He'd left Albuquerque around 5 p.m., planning to drive through the night and arrive in Nevada by morning. The first few hours passed without incident. Warren watched the sun set in spectacular fashion, the sky turning shades of orange and purple that photographs never quite captured. Then came the deep desert twilight, that brief period between day and night when the world seems suspended in blue shadow. And finally, full darkness, the kind of darkness you only get in places far from any city lights. Route 50 through this part of New Mexico was a straight two-lane road that stretched to the horizon in both directions. No curves, no hills, just endless asphalt cutting through scrubland and alkali flats. Warren had been driving for about 4 hours when he first noticed the light. It appeared off to his left, maybe a mile or two distant, a bright white light hovering above the horizon. At first, Warren thought it was a helicopter, maybe military traffic from one of the nearby test ranges. But as he watched it in his peripheral vision, he realized it wasn't moving like a helicopter. It was completely stationary, hanging in the air like a star that had descended too close to Earth. Warren glanced at it a few more times over the next several minutes, curious but not particularly concerned. Strange lights weren't uncommon in this area. The military flew all kinds of experimental aircraft out here, and sometimes their exercises created visual phenomena that civilian observers found puzzling. But then the light moved, not gradually, not following any logical trajectory. It simply shifted position, instantaneous, appearing a quarter-mile closer in the span between one blink and the next. Warren's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He looked at the light directly now, focusing on it instead of watching the road. The light was brighter than before, more intense, and it had been joined by others. 3 lights total now, arranged in a triangle formation, all hovering above the desert at the same height. They were pulsing slightly, their intensity fluctuating in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. Warren told himself it was flares, military flares suspended from parachutes. But flares fell. These lights weren't falling. They were holding position with an impossible steadiness, and as he watched, they began to move. Not laterally this time, but vertically, ascending smoothly until they were perhaps 1,000 feet higher than they'd been moments before. Then they stopped again, resuming their stationary hover. Warren reached for his CB and keyed the mic. "This is eastbound on Route 50, approaching mile marker 98. Anyone else seeing these lights off to the north?" Static answered him. He tried again, adjusting his squelch, but got the same result. The CB was working. He could hear the background hiss of the channel, but no other traffic was coming through. That wasn't unusual out here. This stretch of Route 50 saw very little truck traffic, and at this hour, on a weeknight, Warren might be the only commercial vehicle for 50 miles in any direction. He glanced at his phone. No signal, which was also normal. Cell coverage was spotty at best out here, and he'd learned long ago not to rely on it. Warren looked back at the lights. They'd moved again, repositioning themselves to form a straight line instead of a triangle. And they were closer. Definitely closer. Maybe half a mile away now, near enough that Warren could see they weren't point sources but rather larger glowing objects, disc-shaped or spherical, with clearly defined edges. He eased off the throttle, letting his speed drop from 65 to 50. Some instinct he didn't quite understand was telling him to slow down, to give himself more time to react if the situation changed. The lights continued their steady observation, pacing him now, maintaining that half-mile distance as he drove. Warren checked his mirrors, looking for any other vehicles that might be experiencing the same thing, but the highway behind him was empty. He was alone out here with whatever those lights were, and the isolation was starting to feel less comfortable and more threatening. He thought about pulling over, maybe getting out and taking a better look. But another part of him, the part that had kept him safe through 2 decades of trucking, said that was a terrible idea. Whatever was out there, engaging with it directly felt like crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed. The lights followed him for another 10 miles, maintaining their formation and distance with mechanical precision. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, they ascended straight up at incredible speed, vanishing into the night sky in less than 2 seconds. Warren watched them go, his heart pounding, his mouth dry. He'd seen aircraft before, plenty of them. He knew how planes and helicopters moved, understood the physics of flight. What he'd just witnessed didn't conform to any of that. The acceleration had been instantaneous, impossible, the kind of maneuver that should have generated a sonic boom, or at least some kind of audible signature. But there had been no sound at all, just silent, instant departure, like the lights had simply ceased to exist in one location and begun existing in another. Warren drove for another hour before his hands stopped shaking. He kept expecting the lights to return, to drop back down from the sky and resume their observation. But they didn't. The night remained dark and empty, the stars overhead cold and distant. Eventually, Warren's heart rate returned to normal, and he began trying to rationalize what he'd seen. Maybe they had been military aircraft, some new type of drone, or experimental technology that could perform maneuvers civilian observers would find impossible to explain. That made sense. That was a logical explanation that didn't require Warren to reconsider his understanding of reality. He was still working through this reasoning when he saw the car on the side of the road. It was pulled onto the narrow shoulder, hazard lights flashing. A sedan that looked to be maybe 10 years old. A person was standing beside it, waving their arms, trying to flag Warren down. He slowed his rig, debating whether to stop. Breaking down on this stretch of road was dangerous, and anyone in that situation would be desperate for help. But it was also the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere, and Warren had heard enough stories about ambushes and carjackings to be cautious. He pulled over about 50 yards past the sedan and set his brake, then grabbed his flashlight and his phone, checking one more time to see if he had signal. Still nothing. Warren climbed down from his cab and walked back toward the car, keeping his flashlight pointed at the ground so he wouldn't blind whoever was there. As he got closer, he could see it was a woman, maybe in her 40s, wearing jeans and a light jacket. She looked relieved to see him, almost desperate. "Thank God," she said as Warren approached. "I've been stuck here for 2 hours. My phone's dead, and nobody else has stopped." Warren kept a careful distance, scanning the area around the car for any signs of other people. "What happened?" he asked. The woman gestured at her car helplessly. "I don't know. It just died. Engine cut out and I coasted to a stop. I tried restarting it, but nothing happens." Warren nodded and asked if she minded if he took a look. She stepped aside and he popped the hood, shining his flashlight on the engine. Everything looked normal at first glance. No obvious damage, no disconnected wires or leaking fluids. He asked the woman to try starting the car while he watched the engine. She got in and turned the key. The starter motor turned over sluggishly like the battery was weak, but the engine didn't catch. "Might be your alternator," Warren said, though he wasn't certain. "Or it could be a fuel delivery issue. Either way, you're not getting this thing started without a mechanic." The woman looked like she might cry. "What am I supposed to do? I can't stay out here all night." Warren considered his options. He couldn't fit her in his cab. Company policy and common sense both said no passengers, but he could offer to call for help once he got to somewhere with cell service. "There's a truck stop about 40 miles west of here," he told her. "Place called the Desert Rose, right off the highway. I can stop there and call a tow truck for you. Meanwhile, you should stay in your car with the doors locked. Keep your hazard lights on. Someone will stop eventually." The woman nodded, looking miserable but resigned. Warren gave her his flashlight, told her to use it if anyone sketchy approached, and walked back to his truck. He was about to climb into his cab when he heard the sound. It started as a low hum, almost subsonic, a vibration he felt in his chest as much as heard. Then it grew louder, higher in pitch, until it became a whine that set his teeth on edge. Warren looked up and felt his stomach drop. The lights were back. All 3 of them, descending from directly overhead, moving with that same impossible smoothness. They arranged themselves in a line above the highway, spaced maybe 200 feet apart, and then they stopped. Just hung there, bathing the entire area in harsh white light that made Warren's eyes water. He squinted up at them, raising one hand to shield his face. The lights were enormous this close, easily the size of houses, and they radiated a cold brilliance that seemed to penetrate everything it touched. Warren could see every detail of his truck, every grain of sand on the road, every scratch on the pavement. It was like standing under stadium lights, except these lights came from objects that shouldn't exist. The woman had gotten out of her car and was standing next to it, staring up at the lights with an expression Warren couldn't read. Not fear, exactly, something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. "Get back in your car," Warren shouted to her, his voice barely audible over the whine. "Get inside and lock the doors." She didn't move. just stood there, gazing up at the lights like she was hypnotized. Warren started toward her, some protective instinct overriding his own fear. He made it about 10 steps before the lights shifted again, all 3 of them moving at once. They didn't ascend or descend. They simply repositioned themselves, forming a triangle with the woman at its center. And then something emerged from the bottom of the central light. It was hard to look at directly, hard to focus on. A shape that might have been mechanical or biological or neither. It extended down toward the woman like a limb or tentacle or beam, and she raised her arms toward it like she was greeting an old friend. Warren ran. Didn't think about it. Didn't try to be a hero. Just turned and ran back to his truck as fast as his legs would carry him. Behind him, he could hear the whine intensifying, growing so loud it was painful. And then there was a flash of light so bright it cast his shadow on the road ahead of him, impossibly sharp and dark. Warren threw himself into his cab and slammed the door, locking it with shaking hands. He started the engine, threw the transmission into gear, and stomped on the accelerator. His truck lurched forward, tires spinning on the pavement before catching traction. In his mirrors, he could see the light still hovering above the woman's car. That shape still extended down toward her. Then the lights flared even brighter, bright enough that Warren had to look away. And when he looked back, they were gone. Just like that. Vanished completely, leaving the desert dark and silent again. Warren drove for 20 miles before he felt safe enough to slow down. His hands were still shaking, his heart still racing. He kept checking his mirrors, expecting to see those lights reappearing behind him, but the road stayed empty. Eventually, he reached a point where his CB crackled back to life, picking up distant transmissions from other drivers. Warren grabbed the mic and called out, not caring how crazy he sounded. "This is westbound Route 50, just past mile marker 110. Did anyone else see those lights, the ones over the highway?" A voice responded after a moment, skeptical but curious. "What kind of lights?" Warren tried to explain, stumbling over his words, describing the hovering objects and the woman and the shape that had descended toward her. The other driver listened in silence, and when Warren finished, there was a long pause. "You've been on the road too long, buddy," the driver finally said. "Maybe pull over and get some rest." Warren knew how it sounded. Knew that without evidence, without other witnesses, his story would be dismissed as exhaustion or hallucination. He considered turning around, going back to where the woman's car had been, checking to see if she was still there. But he couldn't make himself do it. The fear was too raw, too immediate. He just wanted to put as much distance between himself and that spot as possible. He drove straight through to the Desert Rose truck stop, arriving just after midnight. The parking lot was about half full, a dozen trucks sitting dark and quiet. Warren backed into a space and killed his engine, then sat there for a long time, trying to process what he'd seen. Eventually, he climbed out and went inside, looking for someone to talk to. The night clerk was a young guy in his 20s, playing on his phone behind the counter. Warren asked if he'd heard any reports about strange lights on Route 50. The clerk shook his head without looking up. "Happens all the time out here, man. People see stuff. Military does tests. Sometimes it's weird." Warren pressed for more details, but the clerk didn't have any to give. Or didn't want to give them. There was something evasive in his manner, like this was a conversation he'd had before and didn't want to have again. Warren bought a coffee and a sandwich and sat down at one of the plastic tables near the window. He pulled out his phone, which finally had signal again, and did a search for recent UFO sightings in New Mexico. There were dozens, hundreds even. Reports going back decades of lights in the sky, objects performing impossible maneuvers, vehicles that stopped working for no apparent reason. Most of them were dismissed as misidentifications or hoaxes, but a very few, had multiple witnesses and no easy explanations. Warren found himself reading through these reports obsessively, looking for something that matched what he'd seen. He found several that came close: triangular formations of lights, objects that hovered and then ascended vertically at incredible speeds, people who reported missing time or strange dreams after their encounters. But nothing about anyone being taken. Nothing about shapes descending from the lights and people greeting them like they'd been waiting for the contact. Warren closed his phone and rubbed his eyes. He was exhausted, physically and mentally. He should sleep, should rest before continuing his drive. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw those lights, saw that woman standing with her arms raised, saw that shape reaching down toward her. He forced himself to eat the sandwich even though he had no appetite, drank the coffee even though it tasted like ash. Then he walked back out to his truck, intending to try to get some sleep in his sleeper berth. That's when he saw the deputy's car pulling into the lot. It was a county sheriff's vehicle, light bar on top, official markings on the door. Warren's first thought was that someone had reported his erratic driving, or maybe his CB transmission had been overheard and misunderstood. But as the deputy parked and got out, Warren realized the man was looking directly at him with an expression that suggested he knew exactly who Warren was. The deputy walked over, a tall man in his 30s with the kind of weathered face you get from working outdoors in desert climates. His name tag read S. Archer. "You Warren Cade?" he asked. Warren nodded, confused about how the deputy knew his name. Archer gestured toward Warren's truck. "Mind if we talk for a minute? Won't take long." Warren agreed, and they stepped away from the other vehicles, far enough that they wouldn't be overheard. Archer pulled out a small notebook and flipped it open. "Got a report about an hour ago. Woman's car found abandoned on Route 50, mile marker 100. Hazard lights still on, driver's door open, but no sign of the driver. That ring any bells for you?" Warren felt his throat tighten. "Yeah," he said. "I stopped there. Woman flagged me down, said her car broke down. I told her I'd call for help when I got somewhere with cell service." Archer made a note, his expression unreadable. "You see anything else while you were there? Anything unusual?" Warren hesitated. This was the moment where he could either tell the truth and risk being labeled crazy, or lie and keep what he knew to himself. He looked at Archer's face, trying to read whether the deputy would believe him or not. Something in the man's eyes, some hint of knowledge or experience, made Warren decide to risk it. "I saw lights," he said. 3 of them hovering above the highway. They came down while I was there, positioned themselves around the woman's car. Then something emerged from one of them. I ran before I could see what happened next." Archer didn't laugh or dismiss the story. He just nodded slowly and made another note. "Describe the lights," he said. "Size, color, behavior." Warren did his best, explaining the triangle formation, the impossible acceleration, the whine they produced. Archer listened without interrupting, his pen moving across the page. When Warren finished, Archer closed his notebook and looked out across the parking lot. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened on that stretch of road," he said quietly. "We get maybe 1 report a year, sometimes more. People see lights, vehicles break down for no reason, occasionally someone goes missing. Never any evidence left behind. No physical trace, just empty cars and confused witnesses." Warren stared at him. "You believe me?" Archer shrugged. "I believe you saw something. Whether it was what you think it was, I couldn't say. But I've lived in this county my whole life. Worked in law enforcement for 12 years. I've seen enough strange things to know that not everything has a rational explanation, or at least not one that makes sense to us. He handed Warren a business card with his contact information. If you remember anything else, give me a call, and do me a favor, don't talk about this too much. People hear stories like yours, and they start getting ideas. Start looking for things that maybe shouldn't be looked for. Warren took the card, not sure what to make of Archer's warning. What happened to the woman? He asked. The one who was standing by her car? Archer's expression darkened. We're looking for her. Search and rescue has been called in, but between you and me, I don't think we're going to find her. Not alive anyway. This area, these lights, they have a way of taking people, and the ones they take don't come back. He left after that, and Warren was alone again with his thoughts and his fear. He climbed into his sleeper berth and tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Every sound outside his truck made him jump, made him think the lights had returned. Finally, around 4 a.m., he gave up and climbed back into the driver's seat. He'd finish this run, deliver his cargo, and then he'd take some time off. Maybe talk to someone about what he'd seen. Maybe try to find other people who'd had similar experiences. Or maybe he'd just try to forget about it. Bury the memory deep and never drive Route 50 again. He pulled out of the truck stop just as the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. The desert looked different in the pre-dawn gray, less hostile and more beautiful. Warren made it to Nevada without incident, delivered his load on schedule, and collected his paperwork. But the experience had changed something in him. He couldn't look at the night sky the same way anymore. Couldn't see lights in the distance without wondering if they were what they appeared to be or something else entirely. He started reading more about UFO sightings and alien abduction reports, not because he believed all of them, but because he was looking for patterns, looking for answers. He found a woman online who ran a support group for people who claimed to have had encounters with unexplained phenomena. Her name was Maven Holt, and she lived in a small town in southern Colorado. Warren reached out to her, explained what he'd seen, and Maven responded within hours. She'd heard similar stories, she said. Route 50 was a hotspot. Something about the geography or the military presence or just random chance made that stretch of highway a place where the barrier between normal and abnormal seemed thinner than elsewhere. Maven invited Warren to attend one of her group meetings, and he drove out to Colorado the following month. The meeting was held in a community center basement, attended by maybe 20 people of various ages and backgrounds. They went around the circle sharing their experiences, and Warren was struck by how similar many of them were to his own. Lights in the sky that moved in impossible ways. Vehicles that stopped working for no reason. Missing time that couldn't be accounted for. And occasionally, people who vanished completely, leaving behind only empty cars and unanswered questions. Warren shared his story, and the group listened with understanding and empathy. No one laughed or dismissed what he said. They'd all been where he was, struggling to reconcile what they'd witnessed with what they'd been taught was possible. After the meeting, Maven pulled Warren aside. "The woman you saw," she said. "The one who was taken. Did she seem afraid?" Warren thought about it, replaying the memory in his mind. "No," he said slowly. That's what was so strange. She looked like she'd been waiting for them, like she knew they were coming. Maven nodded. That happens sometimes. We think maybe they've been in contact before, maybe multiple times, building towards something. And when the moment comes, when the abduction happens, it's almost voluntary, like they're ready to go. The idea disturbed Warren more than anything else about his experience. "Where do they take them?" he asked. "The people who go with the lights?" Maven looked at him with eyes that held deep sadness. "I don't know," she said. "Nobody knows. but I'll tell you what I think. I think they're still alive somewhere. Not here, not on Earth, but alive. And maybe, just maybe, they're better off wherever they are. Warren didn't know if he believed that. Couldn't decide if it was a comforting thought or a terrifying one. He continued attending Maven's meetings for several months, listening to other people's stories and sharing his own. The support helped, made him feel less isolated. But it didn't answer the fundamental questions. What were those lights? Where did they come from? What did they want with the people they took? Warren never found answers to those questions, and eventually he stopped looking for them. He went back to trucking, back to running loads across the country. But he avoided Route 50 after that night, rerouted all his runs to go around it, even if it cost him time and money. Some roads weren't worth the risk. Some encounters weren't worth repeating. Deputy Sloan Archer called him once, about 6 months after the incident. They'd found the woman's car, he said, but never found the woman herself. The search had been called off after 3 weeks with no leads. The case remained open, but was essentially cold. "I wanted you to know," Archer said, "that you're not the only witness. We found 2 other drivers who reported seeing lights that night. Different locations, but same general area. All 3 reports match up in the details, so whatever you saw, you weren't alone in seeing it." That should have been comforting, Warren supposed. Validation that he wasn't crazy, that the experience had been real. But instead, it just made him feel worse. Because if other people had seen the lights too, that meant the phenomenon was ongoing, still happening, still taking people. And there was nothing anyone could do to stop it or even understand it. Warren Cade never saw the lights again after that night on Route 50. But he never forgot them either. They haunted his dreams, those 3 bright objects hovering in perfect formation. And sometimes, late at night when he was driving through empty country with nothing but stars overhead, he'd wonder. Wonder where that woman was now. Wonder if she'd gone willingly into whatever awaited her. Wonder if she was happy wherever the lights had taken her. Or if she was screaming in some place beyond human understanding, beyond rescue or redemption. Warren would never know, and maybe that was for the best. Some questions didn't have good answers, some mysteries were meant to stay unsolved. Franklin Doss had a system. After 15 years of long-haul trucking, you developed systems or you didn't survive. Check your load twice before leaving the depot. Verify your manifest against what's actually in the trailer. Document any discrepancies immediately. Never assume that what the paperwork says matches reality. These weren't just good practices. They were survival skills in an industry where liability could destroy your career in seconds. Franklin followed his systems religiously, which is why he noticed the problem as soon as he opened his trailer that cold March morning in Denver. The manifest said he was carrying 18 pallets of industrial lubricant, each pallet weighing roughly 1,500 pounds. Total cargo weight, 27,000 pounds. But when Franklin counted the pallets actually loaded in his trailer, he came up with 19. Not 18, 19. The extra pallet was at the very back of the trailer, partially hidden behind the others, wrapped in the same clear plastic sheeting as the legitimate cargo. It looked identical to the other pallets, same dimensions, same shipping labels, same everything. Except it wasn't on the manifest. Franklin stood at the back of his trailer in the loading dock of a warehouse on the outskirts of Denver, staring at that extra pallet and feeling a cold knot form in his stomach. This wasn't a clerical error. Someone had deliberately loaded an undocumented pallet into his trailer, and they'd done it in a way designed to avoid immediate detection. Franklin pulled out his phone and called his dispatcher, a man named Luther Haskett, who'd been coordinating Franklin's loads for the past 8 years. Luther picked up on the third ring, his voice rough with early morning fatigue. "Yeah, Franklin, what's up?" "Got a problem with my load," Franklin said, keeping his voice calm. "Manifest says 18 pallets, but I'm counting 19. Need to figure out what's going on before I seal this trailer." There was a pause on the other end. "You're sure? Count again." Franklin counted again, taking his time, double-checking each pallet. Still 19. He told Luther this, and another pause followed, longer this time. "Okay," Luther finally said. "Don't seal the trailer. I'm going to make some calls, see if there was a last-minute addition that didn't get updated in the system. Sit tight." Franklin sat tight for 45 minutes, standing in the cold Denver morning while warehouse workers moved around him, loading and unloading other trucks. Finally, Luther called back. "I talked to the warehouse manager. They're showing 18 pallets loaded, nothing more. They're saying the discrepancy must be on your end, maybe a counting error." "It's not a counting error," Franklin said. "There are 19 pallets in this trailer, and one of them isn't on my manifest. I need someone from the warehouse to come out here and verify." Luther sighed, the sound of someone dealing with a problem they didn't want to deal with. "The warehouse is saying they can't spare anyone right now. They've got a morning rush and they're already behind schedule. Look, take photos of the extra pallet, document everything, and I'll file a report with the home office. But you need to get moving. That load is time-sensitive, needs to be in Boulder by noon." Franklin didn't like it. Something was wrong here. Wrong in a way that made his instincts scream at him to refuse the load entirely. But Luther was right that the delivery was time-sensitive, and if Franklin delayed too long, he'd be in breach of contract. "Fine," he said. "But I'm documenting all of this. Photos, written report, the whole thing. And if this comes back on me later, I'm pointing to these records." He spent the next 20 minutes photographing the trailer contents from every angle, making sure to capture the extra pallet and its position relative to the legitimate cargo. He wrote up a detailed description of the situation, time-stamped and signed. Then he sealed the trailer, climbed into his cab, and pulled out of the warehouse yard. The delivery address in Boulder was a manufacturing facility that produced specialty chemicals, the kind of place with serious security and strict receiving protocols. Franklin had delivered there a few times before and knew they'd inspect his cargo carefully. If there was something wrong with that 19th pallet, they'd find it. That thought should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Because if the 19th pallet was something illegal, if it was drugs or weapons or contraband of any kind, Franklin would be the one held responsible for transporting it. The fact that it wasn't on his manifest wouldn't matter. He was the driver. It was his truck. He'd be the one facing charges. The drive to Boulder took about an hour, Highway 36, climbing up from Denver's elevation into the foothills. Franklin kept checking his mirrors, half expecting to see police lights or some indication that he was being followed. But the traffic was normal, morning commuters and commercial vehicles going about their business. Franklin tried to focus on the road, but his mind kept returning to that extra pallet. What was in it? Who had loaded it? And most importantly, why had someone gone to the trouble of hiding an undocumented shipment in his trailer? The answers to those questions frightened him more than he wanted to admit. He arrived at the Boulder facility at 11:30, half an hour ahead of schedule. The security guard at the gate checked his paperwork and directed him to a loading dock on the east side of the building. Franklin backed his trailer into position and waited while the receiving crew prepared to unload him. A woman named Nellie Truitt, who identified herself as the facility's quality control inspector, approached his cab with a tablet and a stern expression. "You're early," she said, not sounding particularly pleased about it. "I'll need to verify your cargo before we can accept delivery." Franklin handed her his manifest and explained the situation with the extra pallet. Nellie's expression shifted from stern to alarmed. "There's an undocumented pallet in your trailer?" she asked. "You're sure?" Franklin nodded and showed her the photos on his phone. Nellie studied them for a long moment, then handed the phone back. "Stay in your cab," she said. "Don't open the trailer. I need to make a call." She walked away, speaking urgently into her own phone, and Franklin sat there feeling the situation spiral further out of his control. 10 minutes later, Nellie returned with 2 security guards and a man in a suit who introduced himself as the facility's operations manager. "We're going to need to inspect your trailer before accepting delivery," the manager said. "Given the circumstances, we can't verify the contents are safe until we've examined everything personally." Franklin agreed and climbed down from his cab. The manager and guards opened the trailer doors while Nellie stood back with her tablet, making notes. The inspection took 20 minutes, during which they unloaded and examined each pallet individually. The first 18 pallets checked out fine, industrial lubricant exactly as specified on the manifest. But when they reached the 19th pallet, the one at the back of the trailer that wasn't supposed to be there, everyone fell silent. The pallet was wrapped in the same plastic sheeting as the others, but when one of the guards cut through the wrapping to examine the contents, he didn't find lubricant. He found boxes, dozens of them, plain cardboard boxes with no markings or labels. The operations manager pulled on a pair of latex gloves and opened one of the boxes carefully. Inside were smaller packages wrapped in brown paper and sealed with tape. The manager's face went pale. "Call the police," he said quietly. "Right now." Franklin's stomach dropped. "What is it?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know. The manager didn't answer, just stepped away from the trailer and began speaking rapidly into his phone. Nellie moved closer to Franklin, her voice low. "Those packages," she said. "They're not industrial lubricant. They're pharmaceutical product. Unmarked, undocumented pharmaceutical product, which means they're either stolen or counterfeit." Franklin felt the world tilt beneath him. This was bad. This was career-ending, potentially life-ruining bad. He tried to speak, to explain that he hadn't known, that someone had loaded the pallet without his knowledge, but his mouth had gone dry and the words wouldn't come. Within 15 minutes, 3 Boulder police cars had arrived at the facility. Officers took Franklin's statement while detectives examined the contents of the 19th pallet. Franklin explained everything, showed them his photos and documentation, pointed out that the pallet wasn't on his manifest. The lead detective, a woman who listened with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd heard every excuse imaginable, told him they'd need to verify his story. "We'll be contacting the warehouse in Denver," she said. "And we'll be reviewing any security footage from their facility. If your story checks out, you're probably in the clear. But until then, we're going to need to hold your truck and trailer as evidence." Franklin wanted to argue, wanted to explain that holding his truck meant he couldn't work, couldn't make money, couldn't pay his bills. But he knew it wouldn't matter. This was a criminal investigation now, and his concerns were secondary to the needs of law enforcement. He gave them Luther Haskett's contact information and asked them to verify with his dispatcher that he'd reported the problem immediately. The detective said they would, but her expression suggested she wasn't making any promises about his innocence. Franklin was allowed to collect his personal belongings from the truck, and then he was essentially stranded. The police arranged for him to be driven to a nearby hotel where he could wait while they investigated. He sat in that hotel room for 3 days, watching television and trying not to think about how thoroughly his life was unraveling. Luther called him on the second day with an update. "The warehouse in Denver is claiming they don't know anything about the extra pallet," he said. "Their loading records show 18 pallets, nothing more. And their security cameras were apparently malfunctioning that morning, so there's no footage of your trailer being loaded. Franklin felt sick. "They're lying," he said. "Someone loaded that pallet. It didn't materialize out of thin air." Luther's silence suggested he either didn't believe Franklin or didn't want to get involved. "The company is conducting its own investigation," he finally said. "But right now, things aren't looking good for you. They're saying you might have been complicit, that you might have known about the extra cargo and only reported it when you thought you were about to get caught." The accusation stung, especially coming from someone who'd worked with Franklin for years. "You know that's not true," Franklin said. "You know I follow protocol, that I wouldn't risk my career for something like this." "What I know doesn't matter," Luther replied. "It's what they can prove, and right now, the evidence isn't in your favor." They talked for a few more minutes, but the conversation felt hollow. Franklin could sense Luther distancing himself, preparing to cut ties if the investigation turned ugly. After they hung up, Franklin sat on the edge of the hotel bed and tried to think through what was happening. Someone had deliberately planted that pallet in his trailer. Someone who had access to the warehouse and knew how to make a shipment look legitimate. Someone who understood that the best way to move contraband was to hide it among legal cargo, using an unwitting driver as cover. But who, and more importantly, why had they chosen Franklin's truck? Was it random, or had he been specifically targeted? He spent hours going over every detail of the loading process, trying to remember if anyone had acted suspiciously or if anything had seemed out of place. But his memory offered no answers, just the routine chaos of a busy warehouse morning. The Boulder police released his truck on the 4th day. The investigation had cleared him of any intentional wrongdoing, though they made it clear he was still a person of interest in their ongoing case. The pharmaceutical products in the extra pallet turned out to be counterfeit medications, high-value prescriptions that had been manufactured in illegal labs and were being distributed through a network of corrupt warehouse workers and drivers. Franklin's truck had been one of many used to transport the contraband, with drivers chosen specifically because they were known to be reliable and rule-following. The criminals had banked on the fact that honest drivers wouldn't suspect anything was wrong until it was too late. At least, that's what the detective told Franklin when she returned his truck keys. She also told him that they'd identified the warehouse worker who'd loaded the extra pallet. The man had been arrested and was cooperating with investigators, providing names and details about the broader operation. Franklin should consider himself lucky, she said. He'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, but his documentation and immediate reporting had saved him from serious legal consequences. Franklin didn't feel lucky. He felt violated, used, and deeply uncertain about whether he could trust his own industry anymore. His company had supported him throughout the investigation, but there was an unspoken tension now, a suggestion that maybe Franklin should have been more careful, should have noticed something was wrong sooner. He returned to work, but the experience had changed him. He inspected his loads with obsessive thoroughness now, not just counting pallets but examining each one individually, looking for any sign of tampering or inconsistency. He documented everything with photos and written reports, covering himself against any future accusations. And he listened more carefully to his instincts, that voice in the back of his mind that said when something felt wrong. Other drivers noticed the change in him. Over coffee at truck stops and in brief exchanges over the CB, Franklin found himself warning them to be vigilant, to never assume their cargo matched their manifest, to document everything. Some listened. Others dismissed him as paranoid, someone who'd been spooked by a bad experience and couldn't let it go. But then Franklin started hearing stories from other drivers, accounts that echoed his own experience. A driver in Texas who discovered an extra crate in his trailer that turned out to contain stolen electronics. Another in Minnesota who'd been stopped at a weigh station and found to be carrying undocumented firearms hidden among legitimate agricultural equipment. The pattern was consistent. Honest drivers, legitimate loads, with contraband inserted without their knowledge and used as cover for criminal enterprises. The drivers were rarely held accountable once the facts came out, but the damage to their reputations and peace of mind was significant. Franklin realized he'd been part of something larger, a systematic exploitation of the trucking industry by people who understood how to game the system. It made him angry, but more than that, it made him careful. He shared what he'd learned with other drivers, creating an informal network of people who looked out for each other, who warned about suspicious warehouses and questionable dispatchers. Months passed. Franklin continued running loads across the Midwest, and gradually the memory of that March morning in Denver began to fade into just another story to tell over coffee. But he never forgot the lesson. Never forgot how easily he'd come to being caught up in something that could have destroyed his career and his life. He kept his documentation habits, kept his vigilance, kept watching for signs that something was wrong. And one night, about a year after the original incident, Franklin was loading at a different warehouse when he noticed something. A forklift operator working too quickly, moving with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested he'd done this many times before. The man was loading Franklin's trailer, and as Franklin watched, he saw the operator slide an extra pallet onto the trailer in a smooth motion that would have been invisible to anyone not specifically watching for it. Franklin walked over immediately, before the trailer could be sealed. "Hey," he called out to the operator. "That pallet on my trailer. Is it on my manifest?" The operator froze, just for a second, but it was enough. Franklin saw the recognition in the man's eyes, the understanding that he'd been caught. "Check your paperwork," the operator said, trying to sound casual. "Should all be there." Franklin checked. The pallet wasn't listed. He pulled out his phone and started taking photos, documenting the extra cargo. The operator watched him for a moment, then climbed off his forklift and walked away without another word. Franklin called the warehouse supervisor immediately, and within an hour, police were on site. They found the extra pallet contained the same kind of counterfeit pharmaceuticals that had been in Franklin's trailer the year before. The forklift operator was arrested, and his cooperation led to the dismantling of another distribution network. Franklin had stopped it this time, had been alert enough, careful enough, to catch the crime before he became an unwitting accomplice to it. The warehouse thanked him, the police thanked him, and his company formally commended him for his vigilance. But Franklin took no satisfaction from it, because he knew this wouldn't be the last time. Knew that somewhere, right now, another driver was loading a trailer without realizing someone had hidden contraband among their legitimate cargo. Another honest worker was being used as a pawn in someone else's criminal enterprise. Franklin couldn't stop all of it. Couldn't protect every driver or prevent every crime. But he could stay alert, could keep following his systems, could keep warning other drivers to watch for the signs. And maybe, if enough people paid attention, if enough drivers refused to be victims, the criminals would find it harder to exploit the industry. It was a small hope, but it was something. Franklin Doss had learned that in trucking, like in life, you couldn't control everything that happened to you, but you could control how carefully you paid attention, how thoroughly you checked your work, how seriously you took the voice in your head that said something wasn't right. Those things might not guarantee your safety, but they gave you a fighting chance. And in an industry where one bad load could end your career or put you in prison, a fighting chance was all anyone could ask for. He drives more carefully now, checks his manifest twice, his cargo 3 times, documents everything with photos and written reports, calls his dispatcher when anything seems even slightly off. Other drivers think he's paranoid, but Franklin doesn't care what they think. He knows what he knows. Knows that the people who want to use you don't announce themselves. Don't give you warning. They rely on your trust, your routine, your assumption that the system works the way it's supposed to. And when you let down your guard, when you stop checking and verifying and documenting, that's when they strike. Franklin won't let down his guard again. Won't assume his cargo matches his manifest. Won't trust that everyone in the supply chain is honest. It's an exhausting way to work, being constantly vigilant, constantly suspicious, but it's kept him out of jail and kept his career intact. And in the end, that's all that matters. Some drivers never have a problem with their cargo, go their entire careers without discovering any discrepancies or illegal shipments. Franklin used to be one of those drivers, used to think it couldn't happen to him. Now he knows better. Knows that luck is temporary and vigilance is forever. Knows that the moment you stop checking is the moment something will slip past you. So he keeps checking, keeps documenting, keeps warning other drivers to do the same. And late at night, when he's parked at some truck stop and trying to sleep, he thinks about all the drivers out there right now who don't know they're carrying contraband, who will wake up one morning to find police at their door, their lives turned upside down by something they didn't even know was in their trailer. Franklin can't save all of them, can't protect every driver from every threat, but he can tell his story, can share what happened to him and hope that someone listens, hope that his experience prevents someone else's nightmare. It's not much, but it's something. And in the world of long-haul trucking, where you're alone on the road with nothing but your wits and your vigilance to protect you, sometimes something is enough. The road stretches on. The loads keep coming. And Franklin Doss keeps checking his manifest, keeps counting his pallets, keeps watching for that extra shipment that shouldn't be there. Because he knows it's out there, waiting. Knows that somewhere, right now, someone is loading a trailer with something that will ruin a driver's life. The question isn't if it will happen again. The question is whether the next driver will be paying attention when it does. Franklin hopes they will be. Hopes they'll have developed the same systems and instincts that saved him. Hopes they'll trust that voice in their head that says something is wrong. But hope isn't a plan. Vigilance is. Documentation is. Refusing to assume everything is fine just because it looks fine on paper. That's what keeps you safe. Franklin learned that lesson the hard way, and he's never going to forget it. Never going to let himself become complacent again. Because out there on the road, complacency kills careers and destroys lives, and Franklin has no intention of being its next victim.